and welcome to the Describe Your World podcast. This is episode 2. I'm Travis, and I am with my guest, Justin Wiggins. He's the author of Surprised by Agape, Tir na Nog, Celtic Twilight, forthcoming book, Celtic Song, and he has a great love for community, coffee, pubs, England, Scotland, and Ireland. How's it going, Justin? How are you feeling?
Quite well. Thank you for having me on your show, my friend. It's an honor.
Of course. I'm excited. Justin and I have known each other for several years now, and we'll get into a little bit later just the nature of how we met and sort of what that was like if we have time. But I'm really excited. He's a writer and I'm a writer, and we've got a lot to discuss as far as literature and music and faith and just a little bit of everything. But the point of today's episode is just getting to know Justin a little bit better, having him describe his experiences and his sort of some big moments from life and some of the things that kind of motivates him to write and create and things that inspires him. So I want to just kind of kick it off, Justin, with you taking the lead here on early life. I like to frame this first section as like an origin story. So as a writer, I feel like you're going to have a really great time with that. So let's talk about what life was like as a child, your education, any kind of big moments that sort of frame who you are. And then how did we get from small Justin into the writer and traveler and the guy who's passionate about John Foreman and C.S. Lewis and all those other thinkers?
So I was born in 1989 in Kinston, North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina. And growing up, I had a very loving family, was raised by some amazing women, and was raised also in the church, but also had a very inquisitive mind. And myself, speaking for myself, and again, this isn't everyone's experience, but I had a really bad experience with Southern Free Will Baptist theology. Again, everyone doesn't, but I just had a lot of doubts and a lot of questions. And although I was thankful to be raised with the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and my nana, my mother, my Aunt Kim, my grandmother, and there were some good male figures there, like uncles and cousins, and they were really great. But and they did a really good job cultivating those theological virtues. I always I wanted to know for myself, and I didn't want to just believe in a particular worldview because I was taught it growing up. And there was also some really deep father abandonment struggles growing up. So my biological father was there for me some, but when I got older, he would disappear and then he would reappear, and he just sadly never battled his drug addiction, and he had so many people to help him. And so that caused a deep wound, and it made me really suspicious about people claiming that there's a good and loving Abba Father, creator that cares about all of humanity. So, and then around the age of 18, I discovered the music of John Foreman and Switchfoot, and I really love their music because I grew up on a lot of Bob Dylan and Bon Jovi, U2, the Beatles, Simon and Garfunkel, Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, Enya. So I really loved hearing all of those different influences in Switchfoot's music. And I was just really struggling and had a bit of a stuttering issue and was really lost and confused and, didn't know how to articulate my doubts and my questions. And then when I discovered Switchfoot's music, it was very healing and very therapeutic. And that was during high school. And so during high school, I started to come out of my shell a bit. I wasn't as shy as I was in elementary school and middle school. I was still a confused agnostic, but I never really came out as one, because if you do in that sort of community, you're often ostracized from the herd. And so I just never came out with saying, oh, I'm an agnostic, just because I suppose I was a coward and not brave enough. And also I didn't really know how to articulate those doubts and questions. And so, but John Foreman would reference C.S. Lewis in interviews I would read online. And I remember in particular a YouTube video of him talking about the This Is Home song that they wrote for the Prince Caspian movie. And he kept referencing C.S. Lewis. And I'm embarrassed to say this because I know many people grow up reading Narnia or have Narnia read to them. I had no idea who the writer was.
Right.
And I wasn't a voracious reader growing up. I read books like Shel Silverstein, yeah, Where the Sidewalk Ends, The Giving Tree, and so books here and there, but I wasn't a voracious reader, and honestly didn't really have an understanding of how important storytelling and art is to humanity, and it was very foreign to me. And I just decided to eventually check out Lewis's writings, and I was intrigued when Foreman, talking about the context of what inspired him to write This Is Home, he was talking about this yearning and longing that humanity has that's transcendent, and that's for something outside of themselves. And I found it really interesting. I didn't know. I was like, what is he talking about? It's really interesting, but it really intrigued me, and I really admired the fact that he was a follower of Christ, and there's no sacred secular either or, and they made music for people of all worldviews, which is very different in contrast to how I grew up learning. This is sacred and this is secular. You can listen to this, you can't listen to this, and they sort of tore that false either or to bits, and that was really healing for me. And I was like, wow, I've never knew that, and I really admired the fact that they lived out their faith and loved people of all worldviews. And so I thought there must be something to this, Christianity thing. And and I remember getting a 1 volume set of the Chronicles of Narnia when I was 18, and I was just starting community college, was really excited. I had started to read poets like Robert Frost. He was the first poet that I seriously read, and through him, he got me interested in Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson and T.S. Eliot and others. And then when I read Lewis, oh my, it changed everything. I still remember the very day and the very moment, the very hour, and I read the creation story in The Magician's Nephew, and I just remember experiencing this really poignant sense of joy that was like a combination, as Tolkien and Lewis have described, as a type of bitter. It's bittersweet. It's like joy and grief combined together. And as a confused agnostic, part of me wanted to rationalize it and just explain it away and think, oh, well, it's just a chemical reaction going on in my body. But I never bought into this enlightenment rationalistic worldview, honestly, because I found it just very dull, and it finite human reasoning as well. It's finite, and I was always just really,
right.
just always really suspicious of it. It's like the laws of physics came into being, and we're working on explaining that, and that just never really fully satisfied me. And I was like, I'm not just going to stay in the agnostic camp. I really want to know, or stay as an agnostic. I really want to know if there's a God or gods or some force. I wasn't sure. And then having that experience of reading the creation story in The Magician's Nephew was my first transcendent experience of that Zen joy that Lewis wrote about. That beautiful German word expressing the yearning and longing that people experience, evoked by a landscape or a piece of music or love, or really deep personal experiences of the love of God, or piece of visual art or a film, whatever it might be. It's different for different people. And Lewis had that same experience when he was a young atheist and 16 and studying under what he was called the Great Knock. William Kirkpatrick was his tutor, and he read George MacDonald's Fantastes, and he said it baptized his imagination. And he and the rest naturally took longer. He came to know Christ years later, but he from that point was a great admirer of the great Scottish writer. And so my encounter with Aslan singing Narnia into being and having that really powerful spiritual experience really stayed with me and sowed the seed. And although I found other worldviews interesting, I had a gradual conversion. I just came to a point where I realized I was a broken sinner and in need of grace. And I didn't find it derogatory I didn't find it degrading, with like Richard Dawkins would claim, and I just marveled at the fact that if the creator of humanity loved all of us enough to come as a first century rabbi and to under through his incarnation, death, and resurrection, defeat the powers of death and hell and make hope and healing and redemption right here and right now and give a glimpse of what is to come. I marveled at that, and I thought, okay, well, if this God loves humanity enough to, to portray agape love embodied in Jesus of Nazareth, then that's the God I want to follow, and that's the God I want to serve. And so I had a gradual conversion, and I would meet friends at pubs and coffee shops, and graduated from Pitt Community College, and then I went to East Carolina University. And I was cultivating my writing. At first, it was drivel. It was so bloody awful, but it eventually got better, and I found great freedom in writing and discovering, Neil Gaiman or Maya Angelou, the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen, all those amazing writers, and MacDonald and Tolkien and Madeleine L'Engle, Frederick Buechner, Henry Nouwen. Just, I couldn't get enough of it. And it was amazing to me. And I finally understood the importance of imagination and beauty in the life of a Christian, and understood all as art as a sacramental gift. And art was how God used art to bring me to him, and art was how it was through art that I came to know Christ. And I love that Jesus of Nazareth told, parables in the first century to the poor and the freaks and the broken and the outcast. He told these fascinating, moving stories for anyone to be able to understand. And I was like, okay, so God is the great storyteller. He's the great bard, to reference an Irish bardic, thing. The great storyteller, the great artist. And that was really moving to me. And so, it felt great to find my identity in Christ at that point. But as with life, things took quite a drastic turn and I thought, when I was at East Carolina University, and I thought I had this unrealistic expectation that it was going to be true sailing north. Life was going to be much easier because I came to know Christ and found my identity, and what I saw as a vocation. And how wrong I was. So
it never really works like that with Christianity.
No, absolutely not. And so years and years of suppressed father abandonment struggles that I thought I dealt with, and I had not, came out full force when I was at East Carolina University. And it was really hard, and I was starting to have really horrific lows, and it was really alarming because I had never had such hellish lows before and couldn't function, and started to have a really difficult sleeping pattern. And it was a dark night of the soul, my friend. And there were I wrote about it in the first book, Surprised by Agape, and those that know me very well, they know my story. And, we all have our own unique life narrative that's just as important as anyone else's. And it was really difficult, but there was 2 suicide attempts and 2 hospitalizations. Some family members didn't know how to respond. Some did. And it was a really dark time. And I would definitely in that period went through a period of atheism. I didn't become an atheist, but I just found it really difficult to believe in a good and loving God. And I was just really bitter, and I wondered why I couldn't function and why. And it felt like a curse to be a conscious human being on the planet. And man, it was really, really painful. But out of all that suffering, I was able to find good counseling, and I was able to cultivate community. And I ended up moving to the mountains of North Carolina. And after doing barista jobs for a few years, I didn't finish at ECU, but I came to an Inklings conference at Montreat College, which is in Montreat, which isn't far from Black Mountain, North Carolina, and about 20 minutes Black Mountain's about 20 minutes from Asheville. And so went to the Inklings Conference, met Dr. Don King, great C.S. Lewis scholar and friend, and wanted to just move on from Eastern North Carolina. And not as a means of escape, but just as a way of pursuing this passion for literature. And so I moved here and took Dr. Don King's C.S. Lewis class, and the other classes were great. His class will always be my favorite, and graduated from there in 2018. Worked at Montreat College as a librarian assistant for a while. And during that last semester, went to Oxford, England for the first time. That changed my life. First time flying on a plane. I was 28, but my goodness, it was an amazing experience getting to actually see the place where Lewis lived most of his life. Though he was Irish, born and bred, but lived most of his life in England. And he was always fond of Oxford and Cambridge, though I haven't made it to Cambridge yet. And Tolkien lived most of his life in Oxford, and that was just amazing, life-changing. And so since that point, I've found good work here in the mountains of North Carolina. Currently work at Montreat Conference Center, which is actually right across from Lake Susan from Montreat College, and Barnes & Noble. I write for a couple small publishers in the UK. I have been able to cultivate an amazing community here in the mountains of North Carolina and all over the globe, in Scotland, Ireland, England. And these are things that I thought years ago were wishful thinking, you know. I had no idea. I'm just, you know, confused agnostic from Eastern North Carolina. And I definitely in my journey have been surprised by the agape love of Christ, which has absolutely shattered what I thought was possible, what I thought was, you know, wishful thinking. And I'm glad that I was proven wrong.
Nice. I mean, there are a lot of talking points there. I'll try to hit on a couple of things that kind of stick with me or stick out to me as you're going through. That was a really beautiful summary of kind of where you started to now. One thing that, and I kind of picked this up in rereading Surprised by Agape, which I did this week just in preparation for our conversation. But one thing that really kind of sticks with me is just your sort of origins as a child. And, you know, for me, whenever you get into those Southern Baptist, Free Will, Pentecostal churches, and these are people who are extremely passionate about the way that they communicate with God. But sometimes there are also people who don't fully understand the spectrum of ways to communicate with God. Like there are so many different paths and avenues to him. And I find that my experience is very similar growing up in a Free Will Pentecostal Baptist church and in a very, very small city in South Carolina. And I'm sure that we could swap stories all day about what that's like, but it's a very discouraging thing when it comes to growth and adaptation and just an understanding of your relationship with God, because I find that what happened with me is I learned a lot about God and what God is supposed to be and how, you know, God is sort of portrayed, but I didn't learn very much about how to have a relationship with him. Not only that, but I also learned a lot about judgment and criticism and a lot of things that will really hinder your progress in faith versus like helping you grow in faith. So that really sticks out to me as far as your, you know, your introduction and kind of your earlier understanding of who God is. And I can understand, it's almost like your growth is stunted because you can't grow in a healthy manner with your relationship with him. It's kind of like you're just viewing him as this outsider. You know, what are his qualities? What are his attributes that scripture talks about versus how can I know him and how can I talk to him daily? And then just the introduction to C.S. Lewis, because I think, you know, I went to a private school. I went to a Christian school and was in a Christian curriculum. So Narnia was part of my like assigned reading. So my early experiences with Lewis were sort of like that final passage in Magician's Nephew. You're talking about Aslan breathes the world into existence, and that really sticks with me. And then you get into Caspian and some of those others. And ironically, about the same time as when the movies started coming out. So had the visual companion to the reading experience, which was cool. Same thing with Lord of the Rings and Tolkien. Is like the movies were coming out and there was a visual companion and it was really exciting. But similar to my faith, I didn't grasp or comprehend the sentiment behind the movie. It's just there's a movie and it's full of action and that's cool. But what does this mean about who God is? And that's kind of where I think we could probably agree that it's hard to make progress and grow until you have those outside experiences from that environment.
Yes, absolutely. I can relate to your story. Oh my goodness, I don't know how it was for you and growing up in the small town in South Carolina, and I respect friends and family that still live in Eastern North Carolina, and but I just remember, although again, love my family, but just that area there was a it felt honestly like living in a Stephen King movie. There's this really weird, oppressive atmosphere to it.
Yeah.
And I just got so frustrated with how Christianity was presented as a bribe and though there were sincere people and they did a lot of good. It was the proselytizing and the brainwashing, which is so dangerous. And I just found it so frustrating, but I had to learn to not throw rocks at fundamentalists. And like John Foreman said, I'd rather build stained glass windows than throwing rocks at people. And I thought I really liked that. And so it was really difficult after conversion to let go of that frustration and anger towards those fundamentalism and all that it stands for, which is dangerous and has caused many people harm. But I'm glad many people have found healing and hope through finding their own journey like you and I have, and also at the same time loving those people that it can be rather hard to have a dialogue with, and not pigeonholing them or pointing the finger, and just realizing that live and let live, learn to live with your disagreements, and in that context still reflecting the agape love of Christ in your life. And that's what I've tried to do is like seek to live out my faith by grace and love people of all worldviews, just like you were talking about in your journey.
Yeah, of course. And I find that it's a real challenge whenever like, for example, my church family is my actual family. So my church family are like cousins, aunts, and uncles and things like that whenever I was growing up in South Carolina. So it's almost better because it's hard to be judgmental and hateful whenever they're your family members. And you can also take jabs at them a little bit too, because I think they would all kind of understand my perspective of it's a very strong foundation and it's a very scriptural and sort of literal foundation, but it's also a very narrow foundation. And as much as some of those people fit into that avenue extremely well and they feel very comfortable there, I didn't. So for me, it was more about branching out from that and looking for my own path to the Father and sort of an understanding of his grace and love, which I couldn't find in what we were doing. I think maybe you kind of feel that too, is like, you understand that he's a God of love and a God of mercy, but it's hard to see it whenever there's so much like that oppression and negativity surrounding where you are.
Yes, indeed.
So if you feel pretty good, we can move on to the next segment. I really want to get into some of what you have created, some of your work.
Thank you.
Got some questions specifically about Surprised by Agape, some quotes that I pulled out. And it's not that I'm sort of singling that out as like the main piece that people should check out. I think they should check out everything you've written, but it's important for this conversation because it's kind of like your testimony and it really delivers a lot of information about your upbringing and experiences. So I pulled some quotes from there. But before we get into those, I would love it if you will, for the viewers and listeners, just define what agape love is, because there may be some people who are absorbing this information and don't really know that word.
Indeed. Thank you. So the Greek word agape means the Creator's unending and everlasting love for all of humanity. It's a love that never fails. It's a love that always pursues you, and that's transcendent and unending and beautiful and the highest form of love that is possible.
Okay, yeah, exactly. My wife has it tattooed on her arm. Like it's a powerful sentiment. It's like it's kind of like a love that we can't necessarily achieve as humans. It's a love that's sort of limitless and unconditional, and that's something that I've struggled with because I'm fascinated by the concept of love in general. But what really draws me to Christianity is it's a love that I can't replicate. It's a love that I'm going to fail to encapsulate no matter what. And so that's what it means to me. It's almost like it's almost like a word that's above my existence. It's kind of just on a different plane.
I know exactly what you mean.
um, so a couple of quotes from Surprised by Agape, and these will probably open it up for you to expand a little more as well. We kind of touched on the cultural Christianity and the Southern Free Will Baptist perspective. One thing that I think that really stuck out for me was you say, I'm sure Lewis had his own moments when he wished he could go back to being an atheist, to not being interfered with. Tell me how you understand that quote.
So, in the context of reading him, I know for a fact that even after his conversion, he still had very, very difficult issues with faith being a virtue and not a delusion, because when he was an atheist, although he respected people that were religious and spiritual, he liked poets like John Milton and John Donne, G.K. Chesterton, and the great Scottish writer George MacDonald. So even though he disagreed with their worldview, he appreciated their brilliance as writers and thought them very, very important. But he still thought the divine was all nonsense and a human fabrication. And from reading Surprised by Joy, there's also parts in his letters and Mere Christianity and other places in his fiction and essays where you still see that he struggled with doubt, and he had those moments where he wished that he could go back to being an atheist and believing that the world is a sort of cosmic accident, and the 1 in a millionth chance human consciousness came about, and the laws of physics, and all things would come to an end someday. And so he definitely enjoyed that worldview that he would come to critique later on in his life. So I suppose he probably just found that really comfortable, especially, when he was wounded in World War One and lost his Irish friend, Patty Moore, and he took care of Patty Moore's mother, Mrs. Moore, later on in his life, and lost his mother. So he had some heavy wounds, really, really difficult wounds, and I'm sure that was at the root of his atheism. And so when you read those places in his writings, you find it comical. He's like, I'm sure he thought, I wish I could go back to who I was when I was at this place in my life. But he knew that to be honest with himself and honest before God, that there was no going back. There was no escape, I mean, he even did Surprised by Joy when he described his conversion to theism. He said he was kicking and screaming and wanted to get away. And he said, and it's hilarious how he described God as, like that wonderful poem, Francis Thompson's The Hound of Heaven. Lewis described this God wouldn't leave him alone. And he said this Christ started to do what I claimed that it could not do. And he was horrified by that and started to be alarmed, because he would meet all these Christian friends at Oxford, Hugo Dyson, and Owen Barfield was an anthroposophist, but at least he had I think he was later on a Christian, I can't remember, but a very close friend of his. And at least anthroposophy is a sort of an esoteric spiritual view of the world that rejects scientific materialism. And, then he met J.R.R. Tolkien and discovered Chesterton and MacDonald. And so it was like all these Christian writers and Christian friends that he would meet, and he just found it absolutely alarming. And then, of course, eventually bowed the knee and called himself the most reluctant convert in all of England from that iconic passage from Surprised by Joy.
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts about this, and I don't know Lewis as well as, I haven't read him as much as you have, but one of the things that comes off as a little bit funny is this idea of the God of heaven who loves us so much that he pursues us and chases us down
Mm.
versus like I had a conversation somewhat recently with and I won't state specifically what world religion he was a part of and what he believed, but he was sort of separating Christianity from everything else. Is like Christianity has this God that number one died for you, and then number two like pursues you.
Mm.
Whereas there are a lot of these other gods who like you have to seek out the understanding and you have to sort of elevate yourself to that level to be able to meet them. Whereas the Christian God will like chase you and try to find you where you are.
Mm.
And I really like that juxtaposition, and it's something that I think Lewis sort of captures, especially with his own doubt, which comes up again later with John Foreman and all these other thinkers. You know, doubt's always going to be a part of the journey if you're doing it the right way.
Indeed. Indeed.
So the other thing, and you kind of touched on this earlier, so you might just be able to expand a bit. But as I was reading your book, it really stuck out to me, and it made me think a little bit more deeply. One of the things that I do remember from Lewis is that idea of, you know, if there's no way for us to feel totally satisfied, and there's a deep longing and yearning within us that we just can't satisfy with earthly pleasure or with money or with love or whatever the case may be, if everybody's got that deep thing, then maybe there's something outside of the earth and outside of this physical life. And that's, I know it's sort of a thing that you can't really argue in a debate and you can't show a lot of evidence for, but I feel like a lot of people have that
Mm-hmm.
kind of missing piece. And you talk about that quite a bit whenever you're going through your journey in those dark times. And I mean, I think Lewis talks about it too in his running from God and his doubt. Is just like there's this longing, and how do we satisfy that? There's only one way to do that. So my question is that the answer for people who are really looking for that evidence of a creator or a mover or a shaker?
Mm.
You know, we already have that something had to spin things into existence. So there's that. But at the same time, like, why is it that we're so dissatisfied whenever we have access to all this stuff? And I think that's kind of that's where I ended up. That's where I landed on the topic.
Indeed, yes, I do believe so. And as important as intellectual questions are, and historical questions, and evidence for this or that, and all of those have their place, right? But when it really comes down to it, it's this innate, universal, transcendent longing that humanity has, and I think you see evidence of it in the great myths and the great stories, all these different archetypes. And I've had so many wonderful conversations with people who are, whether it's about how they're moved by story or story route or some form of art rouses or evokes that German Sehnsucht, that poignant joy, and they can't get enough of it and they want more, and it gives them a yearning and longing for something outside of themselves. I do think that is a universal experience to humanity, and I do think that people are yearning and longing to know their creator, the great artist who brought them into being. And that was true for me, and it's true for Lewis and yourself and many other people who I've talked to. It reminds me of how important beauty is and how important art is, whether it's music or visual or film, a particular poem or book, and I can't get enough of it. And I love it's amazing and it's wonderful, and I love talking with people, and whether they it's DC or Marvel or Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, or J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, or the George MacDonald's fairy tales, or Madeline L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time series, or Narnia, Middle Earth, Philip Pullman's his Dark Material series. It's really incredible to hear from people why they like a particular form of art and why they're drawn to it. It's really really moving. And Madeline L'Engle wrote that wonderful book, Walking on Water: Reflections on Faith and Time, and she was really helpful to me in my journey. And it's been really incredible to talk with all different kinds of people. Some people share the same worldview. Some people have a different worldview, and what moves them, what makes them come alive. Like the Switchfoot song, "When We Come Alive," those works of art or experiences of beauty make you feel more alive. And although it's fleeting and transient, that poignant experience stays with you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, it's there's some kind of thing that sort of looms over us, and we're always trying to grasp it or reach for it. And there are only certain places where you find it, and there are only certain places where you catch it, and then you only have it for a moment. And so I think that once you catch that sensation and once you understand that to exist, then there's this lifelong journey of recapturing. And I think that's true for faith. Like when I think about faith and I think about belief and I think about leaning into something, it feels like it's a lot harder to believe in things than to not believe in them. And that may be totally untrue because I don't have that experience of agnosticism, but it feels like to just understand that there's no God would be kind of easy, because if there's no God, then we're just a collection of cells and matter and bones, and we're just tumbling through life, and then we expire, and that's it. But if there's a God, then there's this progression, and there's this journey, and there's this epic and this adventure, and we're responsible for it. So it's this heavy weight of trying to do that correctly.
Yeah.
All right. So next thing, I'm kind of going to shift gears a little bit, but still staying in the same lane of your work. There are a couple of books, Celtic Twilight and Tir na Nog, and they're really structured that in a way that you're discussing different figures and writers. You're also including some poetry, some short stories, some essay type pieces. So I'm really curious about your formula, like how you're building your books, and how does that make sense for you? And is that something that, in my mind, the thing that comes to mind is just diversity. Like I want to have a diverse collection of work, and it makes me a little bit easier for me to write if I've got some diversity. But very curious how you feel about that.
So when I started writing more fiction, it was really challenging, and I found it difficult. And I would submit a few stories for Stephen Lester Carr's Sweetie Cat Press, who does a wonderful job of publishing different anthologies and writers all over the world. And his critique of my short stories was very, very helpful. And he gave me the confidence to write more fiction. And so I thought, wow. And then I found actually that I came to enjoy writing poetry and fiction more so than nonfiction. And I wanted Tir na Nog and Celtic Twilight to have to be both fiction and nonfiction. And I wanted to write it in a way where someone can read it in one or two sittings, and I want it to capture the power of story and the influence of the Celtic bardic storytelling tradition, and evoke a sense of wonder and awe and mystery. And it was very challenging, but also a lot of fun. Like Steve Caught of Inspired, who published Marty and Irene, Tir na Nog, and Celtic Twilight, told me this, and it has really stood out to me. He said, just remember, although writing is work, if you're not having fun, you're doing something wrong. And he's right. And I just found it was a lot of work, if you want to write seriously, you have to read widely and write every day, whether you feel like it or not. But it was so much fun because you're taken out of yourself, and these characters come to you, and you're not quite sure where the story will go, or sometimes you do. And although some of the stories in both books are quite heavy, there's always a sense of the virtue of hope and the healing power of music and literature and art. That's really at the heart of those particular books. And I was just so excited to try something different, because Surprised by Agape was great, and I'm really thankful for that Grant Hudson of Clarendon House Publications, and it was fun co-writing Surprised by Myth with him. And Marty and Irene was an experimental book, and friend did the cover art. Tim, great guy. If he watches this, I thank you for the cover art, my friend. And it was really fun. I just wanted to try my hand at a full work of fiction, but thus far, Tir na Nog and Celtic Twilight have been my favorites, because those two books were inspired by a much needed holiday. I hadn't been on holiday for 3 years, and it was finally great to get to Ireland and Scotland and England. And those and going there for the first time. Well, Ireland and Scotland for the first time was life changing and just amazing getting to see these beautiful countries associated with uh, William Butler Yeats and Oscar Wilde and James Joyce and great C.S. Lewis and also the great Seamus Heaney, favorite Irish poet. Lewis will always been my favorite writer, but as far as poets go, Seamus Heaney, my goodness, when I discovered him, I couldn't get enough of his work. And so, yeah.
You have to remind me when we get to the end because I didn't put it in our template or topics, but I want to get maybe we'll do it during your like closing statements.
Sure.
Definitely want you to make some recommendations for our viewers and listeners. So maybe as we go through, just have in the back of your mind like 3 pieces, whether they're books, poems, or pieces to listen to.
Sure.
And that way people can go dig into some inspirational stuff for you. So regarding those 2 pieces in particular, how would you say that those are different? How are they similar? I understand structurally kind of similar, but are there some is it like a spiritual successor or spiritual?
So although Tir na Nog and Celtic Twilight are similar in their structure of poetry, fiction, and essays about writers from Ireland, Scotland, England, and America, they are different in the sense of Tir na Nog is inspired by the ancient Irish myth. It's a beautiful myth, and in the myth, Tir na Nog is the Isle of the Blessed, the Isle of Eternal Youth and Beauty, where the Twa de Nu, or the fairy folk, the Fae live, and definitely an influence on Tolkien's elves, and definitely an influence on Lewis's imagination, because he heard that as a young lad growing up in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and that myth moved him profoundly, and so I was fascinated when I first came across the myth, and when I was in Ireland and got to see places like Dunluce Castle, which inspired Cair Paravel in the Narnia books, or the Giant's Causeway, and which also inspired the geography of Narnia. It's called County Antrim, which isn't too far from Belfast. Beautiful places in like a fairyland, and also in Southern Ireland, the Cliffs of Moher, the most beautiful place I've ever seen in my life. That was so inspiring to me. And when I was there, it made me appreciate Ireland more. And Ireland is my favorite country I've ever been to. And so I became, like Lewis was so passionate about Norse mythology. He loved Celtic mythology, but Norse mythology was his favorite by far. And so, sorry about that. So Tir na Nog was definitely an influence on him and his imagination and his writing. And so that ancient Irish myth inspired the book, and I give a context on it, and it roused that Zinzuk yearning and longing in his life. And Celtic Twilight was inspired by William Butler Yeats and what was called the Celtic Revival in Ireland at the time. And W.B. Yeats was a very important Irish poet, and played a huge role in popularizing the ancient bardic storytelling tradition and Celtic mythology and spirituality, and the importance of the Irish language. And so I was so inspired by how much he loved Ireland and how much he was proud to be Irish, and the Irish bardic storytelling tradition. And he actually wrote a book called the Celtic Twilight, Fairy and Folklore. So I stole that title from the book. But it's like John Foreman referenced that. He paraphrases that T.S. Eliot quote that different good writers borrow and great artists steal. Not calling myself a great artist by any means, but I like him, and I can relate to that. So I definitely got Celtic Twilight from William Butler Yeats, and was inspired by him when writing Celtic Twilight.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, I love Yeats. I think it's so fascinating that you're able to sort of build something in a way that feels sort of structurally sound, routine. Maybe it's a little bit relatable for a reader. It's a little bit easier for a reader. But then they're so different. They come from different places and they have their own sort of inspiration and sources and things like that. You mentioned earlier Marty and Irene being sort of experimental. And it may be, in my opinion, I dare say, the most different from all the things that you've written, just because it's a love story and it's not exactly in the same vein as the others. So I guess the question that comes from that is, how do you define romantic love, and how do those two characters really embody your vision of what that is?
So in my view, a romantic love is a gift from the creator, and it's a very powerful thing. And when I was writing that story, I got the inspiration for Marty from Back to the Future, Marty McFly. At least the name, the Marty character is different in the story. And Irene, the name Irene was inspired by the character Irene from George MacDonald's wonderful book, The Princess and the Goblin. And in the story, I just wanted to capture the risk that we all take with romantic love, because one has to come to a place of surrender, and you're risking everything to be with someone, and you're being very vulnerable, and it's not really logical at all, but it's worth it, and it's worth coming to a place of surrender. And so in the story, I wanted to capture the the lows and the highs that these Marty and Irene have. And in the story, Marty is the more he's not as stable as Irene, and she's Irish, has a fiery Celtic spirit, and the more stable of the two. And so it's really challenging for her to develop this relationship with Marty, because he has been through a lot of trauma, and she's been through her own, but he is not as stable as she is. And so it's very risky for her. And so in the book, I just wanted to capture the importance of romantic love, and how powerful of a thing it can be if two people meet each other where they are, and there's the trust and devotion and surrender and and that's what it comes down to. Romantic love is a gift, and it's a choice. Feelings are important, and yes, there's infatuation, and but infatuation doesn't last, and although feelings are important, you can't trust your feelings always. And love, when it comes down to it, is a choice, and you choose someone else over all others. And that's what I was trying to convey in that book. And also wanted to write a great ode to books, because Marty works at a bookshop, and Irene and is a writer, and Irene is a musician. So it's a great ode to, again, the healing power of music and literature and art, and was really challenging. I didn't really know where I was going with it, and I've been so thankful for the response. It was definitely an experimental work, and I love the cover art. Turned out well, and Steve Cald of Impspire did a really brilliant job with publishing it. My friend Timothy Silver did such a good job with the visual art, exactly how I pictured Marty and Irene. He had in his mind, and it was amazing. And I'm really and thankful for the endorsements from local author friend Henry Mitchell, and Irish poet friend Jared White. So it was definitely different than any of the other books, and so it was good. It was good for me to get out of my comfort zone with that one.
So one of my experiences of writing, or one of my earliest experiences with writing, is when I was in college. I took an intro to creative writing class, and the challenge is, and maybe you can relate and kind of experience the same thing, but the challenge is you tend to write characters that are just kind of like you. My voice and my experiences just bleed into the characters. And so my writing instructor was extremely critical of the fact that the narrative voice is kind of jumbled up, because the only thing that my characters can do or talk about or act on is my own experience, which is very limited. So maybe that's something that, you experience whenever you're creating a new story, is how do I remove myself, and what kind of character am I trying to craft? But it sounds like when, writing Marty and Irene, that you challenged yourself and decided to take on a novel or a piece that's little bit different, not really in your wheelhouse.
Indeed. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And those experiences of getting out of your comfort zone with your writing, although quite scary and yeah, well, scary and unsettling, it's good for you, and it teaches you to cultivate your craft, and you continuously cultivate your craft and get better as a writer. That's really the point.
So this last question might be a little bit leading, and it might be a little bit touching on the ego, but what is your favorite piece or passage that you've written? So if you're diving into your own work, what do you look back on fondly, and what would you point others to read?
Uh, uh, that's a very good question. So in regard to favorite book, that would certainly be Tirnanog, and um, it was goodness, so much fun, and loved again that ancient Irish myth. I'm just fascinated with it. It will always be part of my psyche. It's always in my mind, whatever I'm writing. And in fact, I wanted to share a poem from the forthcoming book, Celtic Song, called Tirnanog, and I hope people can relate to it. So it's called Tirnanog. The transcendent desire was there before I ever experienced it in time and space. My father's treachery only intensified it, and the memory. And let me begin that over again, I guess, when we re-record. Goodness, sorry.
Oh, you're good.
Tirnanog. The transcendent desire was there before I ever experienced it in time and space. My father's treachery only intensified it, and though numerous times I was close to death, I was spared and had a potent glimpse of the eternal ethereal place. All the books, songs, films, and rich, life-changing experiences evoked the sins of joy C.S. Lewis and Seamus Heaney wrote so poignantly about. The two great Irish writers became kindred spirits and helped me figure out that the desire for the mystical isle of Tirnanog, where the Fae live upon, was no delusion, but an objective desire to know my creator outside of myself. My reason, imagination, faith, and desire came together under the spell of the deep magic before the dawn of time. The song of healing sung by the great bard restored my broken heart and mind in Tirnanog with the Celtic song of faith, hope, love, and sacramental bread and wine.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
It really evokes that, what we were discussing earlier, that sense of longing and kind of the place that art and beauty and all of these different concepts have. And I wouldn't say a muse, but almost like the driving force.
Thank you.
Beautiful. So I'm curious, just kind of piggybacking on talking about your books, what is your process like as a writer? I know you mentioned earlier the jobs that you have. You're a very busy guy. Do you have a routine that you like to do? Do you like to write in the morning? What works the best for you?
Oh, yes. So I know different writers and artists have their own rituals or daily habits that they cultivate in regard to their writing. For myself, I do enjoy writing in the morning, and also find, though, that although I enjoy writing in the morning, I write better in the evening or at night. I usually like to brew a good cup of tea or coffee when I write, and I find the habit very homely and comforting, and there's nothing like, whether it's instant coffee, which this is, not a coffee connoisseur. I mean, it's a decent kind, or yeah, or if I'm at home, which I do most of my writing at home, but also at a local coffee shop or a pub or a bookshop, wherever I'm at, I will write out thoughts. If it's an essay or something that's happened in the day, or if it's a song or a memory or a poem, I'll write it out in a journal. I usually like to use it's a Celtic writing journal that Peter Popper Press publishes, and they've been around since the 1920s, and it's beautiful. That's not the only particular one, but I always like to write out by hand, and then I'll type it up. So that's the way that I go about it, and there every now and then there'll be a day when the day goes by and I think, oh my goodness, I didn't write anything and my conscience will bother me. But for the most part, I do write every day. And it's like if you're a musician, you need to practice every day. If you're a visual artist, you should practice every day. If you're a carpenter, practice every day. If you're a surfer, even if it's winter, and if it's not too cold, you should probably get out in the water, you know? So whatever your craft, it's good to do it every day because you cultivate it and you discover things and you get out of your comfort zone, and the joy that is experienced in the creative process is just absolutely fascinating because you're taken outside of yourself. And like John Foreman has described it, you're have the feeling as if you're used as a vessel of some sort. And it's not about you, you get yourself out of the way. And to reference Madeline L'Engle in regard to that, she wrote some wonderful things about that. It gets the ego out of the way and you're immersed in the story or the narrative, and it's an incarnational experience and a form of prayer. And you are, like Tolkien said, you're co-creating with God in that way. And the times that I feel closest to Christ is when this is subjective for different people, right? But when I do, the times that I feel closest to Christ is when I write, or when I'm immersed in a book. There's something very healing and in very powerful about that, where you're reminded of the great storyteller telling the story of your own life. And so, yes, and I find that having those daily rituals is really helpful because if you don't have that daily discipline, you can have all the ideas, but you're not really going to get anywhere. And you can't sit around waiting for the muse to strike. That's not how it works. If you read the great writers, they, like Ray Bradbury, he always had the emphasis, you can't sit around and wait for the muse to sort of show up. You have to cultivate your craft, and also to remember to have fun with it and not take it seriously enough. But and it is work, but yeah, have fun with it. And Neil Gaiman's written some wonderful pieces on that as well. That's been a great influence on me and really, really helpful.
Yeah, when I start working on something, a lot of the time I used to just write. I would just start, and that worked fairly well for the first like 30,000 words. And then I realized that I need like a poster board and a map and a schedule because if I don't have, chapter 1 through the end mapped out, I'm not going to write it. And so like I definitely write a little bit better at night, I think, as well. There was a time when I was working on a blog and I was writing a new piece maybe once every couple weeks. And then I challenged myself and I said, I'm going to write every day for a week. And even if it sucks and it's only 200 words, I want to have some piece to, edit, revise, and kick out every day by the end of the day. And it felt very challenging and it felt very stressful, but it also kind of pushed me to think a little bit harder and craft something that worked in a narrative. And so that's kind of my experience too, is, if you're a person who pursues some type of art or craft, you just have to do it. And even if it's bad, you just keep doing it. And eventually it won't be bad, or eventually you'll write something that you're really proud of.
Yes, that I really appreciate you conveying that, because like I had said earlier, when I started writing, it was absolute drivel and it was so bloody awful. But one has to start somewhere, and it took me a while because at first I was trying to sound too much like my favorite writers, and then I realized, although I'm influenced by them, they should help me find my own voice. And once I understood that, they did, and then I found that freedom. And I've been told I have a very conversational writing style. As if someone is in a pub or a coffee shop or bookshop with me, and I love that because it makes me, it allows me to know that I'm not trying to imitate my favorite writers, though you do build off of them. And like you're saying, when you challenge yourself, you find that you are capable of things that you didn't think you would be. And you are discovering new characters, and you get inspiration in very interesting, unique ways, and you get ideas for books that you wouldn't if you had not challenged yourself. And you have that daily ritual that is a really good structure. It's almost like a liturgy of sorts, and you're part of it, and it's solid foundation. And once you cultivate that, it's there every day, and it's something to look forward to. You know, even on the days that you might be tired, or you might be stressed or grumpy, or you know, it might be a difficult day, or you might be struggling with something or going through something difficult. And in my struggles with anxiety and depression in the past, I've found those daily rituals to be absolutely healing and therapeutic, and it gets me out of the way and reminds me that I am part of something bigger than my own self. And it brings you joy, and that joy cannot be replaced. And it's an absolutely wonderful thing. And also, as you were saying, it's also good to have an outline, especially with if you're working on a story. Some stories I find you don't know exactly where they'll go, and then other stories you do know where they're going. If that makes sense, it's really interesting how sometimes that works. I'm sure it's the same for musicians. Like they get the melody first, and then the lyrics come later, you know, or or the lyrics come first and then the melody comes later. So it's really interesting how the creative process works. And I guess if you're working on a novel, like when I had Marty and Irene, it was very helpful to have an outline. Or the next book that's coming out next year, Celtic Dawn. It's been really helpful to have a timeline of an outline for this, so that way it's not all over the place, and you do have a good point of reference. So I relate to what you were saying about having a schedule and an outline that is a good point of reference, and you know where you're going to some degree.
For sure. Yeah, I definitely think that without some type of structure, you're at some point you're going to get writer's block, or you're going to fall off.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing more frustrating than writing something really good and then not ending it and not completing it. So definitely something that I feel quite often whenever I'm writing and I'm excited about writing, and then I'm like, oh, I don't know how to finish this, so we're kind of done.
Oh yeah, that can be quite torturous.
So it's part of your writing, so I wouldn't lean too much into like past experiences, maybe just experiences with publishing and creating and things like that. So what do you understand your highest point to be, and then what would you understand your lowest point to be, and how those things affected you?
Well, certainly my lowest point. I'm no academic or scholar and no professional editor, and I have found that my lowest points are not catching just minor forgivable grammatical errors that my readers have never even really mentioned to me, which my overtly analytical brain freaks out when I see something like that. So yeah, so I could read through something a million times and still not catch it. And that's on me, you know, because you need to have your draft to be the best that it can be. And once you submit a final manuscript, you want it to be the best that it can be. But I can't tell you how many times it's just small, again, minor grammatical errors. And so I've gotten much better with that. And it's taught me to not be in such a hurry with getting your book out there, because you can do that. And really, I can give a comical example. When Surprised by Agape first was published, I did not catch this. I had George MacDonald's year of birth wrong, and I didn't realize that. And, you know, not many people would probably even noticed it or even saw it. But my Scottish friend David Jack, who endorsed it and who does a lot of good work with George MacDonald's with translations and books and et cetera, he caught it. And, and I felt so embarrassed, and I panicked and freaked out. And no one but me was my own worst critic. No one said anything, but he caught it because he's, you know, knows McDonald's work better than I do. And so as soon as he caught it, I was able to let Grant Hudson McLaren House Publications know, and I was freaking out, and it's just the way my overtly analytical brain works. And so he was able to correct it. So this is encouragement to other writers. You will make mistakes. You will not catch all the edits. You could have a brilliant professional editor, write for HarperCollins or Tor or whomever, and there's always going to be an error at some point. So let that be of encouragement to know that you're going to make mistakes and learn from that, and don't let it steal your joy of finishing something that's honest and hopeful and that you're proud of, because that's been really difficult for me. So that would be a low too, is like those errors. I can panic and freak out and think, oh my goodness, I'm a shite writer, what am I doing? And I know and those thoughts are absolute nonsense and lies. And so I've had to really learn to not let those experiences steal my joy that is there when I finish an honest work of art. And in fact, and understand there's an element of comedy in it, because to be human is to be finite, and you're not going to catch all the errors, and you're going to make mistakes. C.S. Lewis made mistakes in his work, and I'm sure Tolkien did, and you have to learn to laugh at yourself. Of course, if you do catch those errors, you want to correct them. Don't be lazy and do correct them. So yeah, that would be a low. Just being very critical of myself. Just again, in regard to forgivable grammatical errors that can be corrected, and that was corrected ASAP, and this was goodness, almost 5 years ago now. So yeah, that would definitely be the low point. Overtly analytical, very self-critical, learning to not let that steal my joy. And I guess and the high point, I suppose, would be for me that joy experienced in the creative process, and it's so wonderful, and I love it. I absolutely love it. Writing is my passion, and writing is something that I will always do, and definitely feel as if I'm part of as you yourself as a writer. Well, all writers, I guess, are in a sense, they're part of it. Ancient, and to give a Celtic context, I like to think, thousands of years ago, before anything was written down, the bards would sing stories to delight and move people, and that's what modern day writers do. So in that context, I guess the highest would be, I feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself. It's a liturgy of sorts, and you're part of this storytelling tradition that it's different cultures have different ways of expressing it, whether it's the Celtic or the Norse or Native American, German, African, whatever it might be. But yeah, it's wonderful to be in that bardic storytelling tradition, and I geek out on the Irish writers, and I'm honored to feel as if I'm part of that.
Absolutely. Do you have, let's say there's a writer who's approaching you who hasn't written anything before, and that person just wants some tips or thoughts about where to start, and kind of what your wisdom would be as a professional and an expert in the craft. How are you gonna guide that person along? Just for people who, there may be some people listening who really care about it. It may be somebody who wants to start writing.
Indeed, I would say write about things that interest you, that make you come alive, that move you. And it could be a memory, it could be something funny, it could be a passage from a book or a quote from a film, whatever it might be. Start small, don't overwhelm yourself, and get it out on the page. Don't be afraid, don't be discouraged. One has to start somewhere, and that way you can cultivate your craft, um, and it'll be exciting to see where it will go, and start it. And as Neil Gaiman has said, finish what you start. It might take some time, but really dive into it and see what will happen with it, and um, find a friend, or try to cultivate a community around you, and find those kindred spirits that do have an appreciation also for writing and for the importance of art. And that will be incredibly encouraging, because if for me, when I was starting out, I didn't know what I was doing. I would write every day. This was way before Surprised by Agape, and I only knew a few people that shared that same passion. And it took a long time, but I was sort of out in the dark with it, but I kept cultivating it, and I found people that believed in what I was doing, and they believed in me, and that encouragement was immensely important. And I've tried to do the same for other writers and musicians and artists that I encounter, because um, my favorite writers and artists, musicians, classic or contemporary, they all have uh, influenced me to encourage and to inspire as they have, and also to read widely. If you're going to be a writer, yes, read widely, classics, modern. You'll find your favorites. You'll find your favorite genres, or read outside of your favorite genre. If you're a musician, expose yourself to different genres of music. So yeah, definitely cultivate your craft and be encouraged, and start small, and write about things that interest and inspire you, and try to cultivate a community of genuine kindred spirits that will critique your work, and that will offer honest opinions, and that will also encourage you, and build you up and take you seriously. And in my experience, when I found those things, it changed everything.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, just my own advice if someone were coming to me, because I know it's an experience I had and it's experience that helped me grow a lot. If you write
Mm.
something and you share it with someone and that person says it's bad, there's a chance that it's bad. And that's okay. Um, it's something that I experienced, and it's something that I remind myself as a writer is like sometimes what you create's not that good.
Hmm.
Um, and keep writing, because eventually it will be. Unless you're some type of prodigy, it's not going to be wonderful right from the jump.
Hmm.
So my encouragement is just keep writing, because if you love it, you're going to want to do it.
Indeed, that's solid advice. That's been true to my experience.
So as far as travel goes, you're a guy who travels quite a bit, and you've seen some of the coolest corners of the world as far as I'm concerned. Um, so I'm curious, what's a travel experience that you've had that really has fundamentally shaped you as a person and as a writer? What's something that you can point to and say, this was big, this was a moment for me?
Wow. There are a few that come to mind, and those travel experiences were really rich and life changing. And it was a lot of hard work to be able to make those trips, but it was worth it. And I was immensely thankful, and I was able to get off the time from work, and to plan out the itinerary and etc. One particular that comes to mind was seeing Dunluce Castle in Northern Ireland. And when C.S. Lewis was a young lad, he would go with his brother Warnie and his mother Flora and Father Albert there on holiday. And it is in County Antrim. And if I remember, I'm pretty bad with geography, but if I remember correctly, Dunluce Castle is maybe about an hour outside of Belfast. But that beautiful castle from, I believe, the 16th or 15th century, it felt like, to use a Celtic term, a thin place where the veil of heaven and earth come together. And it was just absolutely gorgeous and breathtaking to look out on the sea, and the feel the wind, and to be right there where Lewis went as a young lad and would often go back, and that inspired Care Paravel in the Narnia books, and also all that geography in County Antrim that you could see from Dunluce Castle. There's a beach there, and there's some caves you can explore, and the Giant's Causeway isn't too far. And there's a wonderful Irish legend about Finn McCool creating the Giant's Causeway, and I think if I remember, he got in a fight with a Scottish giant. I can't remember all the details of the story, but it's a delightful story about how the Giant's Causeway was created. That was so inspiring and fired my imagination and gave me the inspiration for Tir na Nog, and I felt like I was on the threshold of Narnia.
Nice. Do you think that your local experiences in North Carolina and college and things like that have more of an effect on you versus the international experiences, or do you think they're all just one experience that are shaping you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I know it's different for different people. I would say that although the important experiences here in the mountains of North Carolina, they have been really rejuvenating, and I love the landscape here. I know the mountains of North Carolina influenced, Thomas Wolfe and Carl Sandburg and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and many other poets and writers, musicians, and I love it. The landscape, Appalachia, is beautiful, and it's just absolutely wonderful, and it's has its own charm and its own unique beauty. And I do find good creative inspiration here, and I feel as if I put down roots. But I will say that the experiences in Scotland and Ireland and England have been more poignant and more inspiring. And again, this is just my own experience. Some people that live in the states, they might find their local state to be more inspiring than experiences they have outside of the country when they go. It's always interesting to hear about those experiences that writers have. But yes, and out of them all, Ireland, as much as I love England and Scotland, Ireland has been the most inspiring of all.
That's awesome. I hope to see it soon.
Yeah.
COVID has obviously hampered our travel plans a bit, but we really wanted to go for a honeymoon to Israel and ended up just traveling the south because it was a lot safer.
Yeah, I understand. Well, I hope you get to Israel someday. I've never been, but friends that have been, they've told me it's really a really powerful experience. And definitely treat yourself and go someday. You certainly deserve.
So I wanted to go into our first meeting because not necessarily that it informs your worldview necessarily, but I think it's a nice representation of how artists and like-minded people come together and have these wonderful experiences. At least for me, it's a very memorable experience. And I wanted to lead into it a little bit, and then I'll let you take the reins and kind of share your thoughts and feelings about it too. So a few years ago, Justin and I, we met each other at a concert. It was in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I hadn't seen Switchfoot in a while. It had been maybe a year and a half or so, but I try to see them as often as possible when they're in the Carolinas. But we sort of came together super early. I think we were the first two people at the concert. So, Justin was parked sort of right in front of the venue, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I made my way up toward the front, and I saw him in his car. All right, perfect opportunity. I'm going to ask this guy because he really knows what he's doing. What to do. And so we came together and ended up going through VIP together, meet and greet together, entertained the concert together, sang together, jumped together, and did all that fun stuff. And in the small spaces in between things were happening, we were just kind of bonding, which was cool because for me, making friends is kind of hard. I'm not someone who makes friends very easily or finds kindred spirits. So meeting a bunch of people that I didn't know and befriending them all in the same time space was like a pretty crazy experience. And that's just the beauty of music and what that universal language that John Foreman and many others talk about is, you might not relate on some fundamental planes and some fundamental values, but music can bring people together in a way that's just magical and incredible. And so I really wanted to kind of lead in with that. And then we want to get Justin's thoughts on that too. So I'll let you sort of take over.
Yes, I remember very well meeting you in 2019, and it was October, and I don't remember the exact day, but I do remember it was John Foreman's birthday
It was.
day. And I remember walking up and seeing you, and we, I remember saying, "Hey," and we were talking about our love for favorite, our love for Switchfoot and different songs, and then you, mentioned C.S. Lewis, and you were telling me about how you enjoyed writing, and you took writing classes in college, and so definitely that struck up a good friendship. So it was wonderful meeting you there, and brings back a very, very good memory and a very good reminder of how, like you were just saying, music can bring many people together, and through a favorite band you can make incredible friends, and or favorite writers, and so it definitely was a start of a good friendship.
Yeah, I have some positive memories from that experience. I have one negative memory being whenever I met Switchfoot, which is my second time meeting them VIP, but I went straight to John and kind of said happy birthday. And there's always this thing in the back of my mind where I'm thinking, one day I'm going to get to play with them. One day I'm going to get on stage. So I went straight for John and I was like, dude, if you need somebody to play with you tonight, man, it was the most ridiculous comment. And he's like, you're my guy or whatever. And I kind of knew at that point that they weren't going to entertain that idea. But I kind of probably looked like a fool in doing that, but at the same time, it's worth a shot. But I've seen fans get to play with them on YouTube clips and stuff like that. So I had to shoot my shot and take a shot at getting on stage. But it was also a bit embarrassing because I think everyone else in VIP knew it was his birthday except for me. So I picked up that tidbit on the way to him. So it was a fun time, and I remember Justin bringing a copy of his book and sharing it with John, and everyone was really excited. It was a good experience, and the show itself was really, really good. They had a great set list, and they threw in a lot of songs that they normally wouldn't play. But the show itself was great. We were very close, right in front of the stage. We were one of the first couple of people to get up in that space right in front of the stage, so we were close. And a bunch of our friends whom I met during the day were around us too, and they were enjoying the concert with us.
Yes, very, very good memories. The best Switchfoot
So,
show that I've ever seen, honestly.
so are you still keeping up with Switchfoot? What are you listening to right now, or are you kind of up to date on their catalog?
Oh yes, I really enjoyed Interrobang. It's very different, and always my favorite album by them will be Vice Versus. And although all of their albums are good in their own right, they were recently in Asheville, and I missed them playing at the Orange Peel, and some of our friends that was at the show in Wilmington were there, and I hated to miss them, but sometimes you have to work and miss live music, but that's okay. But I do hope to see them on their Christmas tour that they're going to be going on. But I've enjoyed their most recent album, and I've been more so recently though. I've been listening to more of John Foreman solo work, and in fact, as much as I love Switchfoot, now at this place in my life, I prefer John Foreman solo work because it's more intimate and speaks to me on a more personal level more. But I will always have a great affection for Switchfoot's music, and in regard to other music, I've been listening to the High Kings, which they are an incredible Irish musicians, and Gaelic Storm, Enya, Howard Shore's, Lord of the Rings soundtrack, and I'll go back and listen to old Reliant K or Red Jumpsuit Apparatus, Sugar Ray, Motown. So it's always good to go back to some older music, but definitely as of recently, a lot of John Foreman and Irish musicians.
Yeah, you mentioned Vice Versus. I struggle with picking a favorite because Vice Versus is like top two, and then Nothing is Sound. That's my other top one. So those two are my number one and number two, and the order of those two changes. I really like the darker albums,
Mm.
Where the Light Shines Through really caught me off guard. That one was really good, and I wasn't expecting it to be so good.
Mm-hmm.
But all three of those are top tier. And then mentioning Reliant K kind of takes me back to high school a bit, but I still love Reliant K on
Yeah.
occasion. And my wife loves Motown, so she's gotten me into all the
Um,
stuff that I listened to as a kid with my dad. So like
and hopefully she's got you listening to the Smokey Robinson and the Spinners and the Drifters.
yeah, Smokey Robinson, Temptations is a big one for us. We went to see the Temptations off Broadway show somewhat recently. But yeah, no, music is beautiful, and it's all this universal thing that we can all feel something and learn something regardless of if we like the sound or not. And I think that the fact that Switchfoot doesn't allow themselves to go into a box and they sort of stick out and do their own thing and not just fall under like that Christian moniker, but they just write music for people and they write music for thinkers is a big part of why I relate so heavily, I think.
I completely agree, and I really appreciate that about them. And as far as John Foreman's most recent album, Departures, oh wow, what a powerful album! And The Ocean Beyond the Sea is my favorite song of his. Before that, it was The Cure for Pain. But my goodness, The Ocean Beyond the Sea evokes that Zinzuk, and it's has a mythical feel to it, and it also reminds me of the Irish myth of Tir na Nog. Very powerful song. How about yourself? What would you say is your favorite song by John Foreman, or one of your favorites?
Tough.
Or one of your favorites? Yeah,
I have so many for both Switchfoot and for John. So for Switchfoot, I would say it's probably Where the Light Shines Through, the song.
Yeah.
Or Vice Versa, the song.
Yeah.
Those two are extremely powerful songs because they come from a place of hurt and they come from a place of darkness. And it's so beautiful that he's able to find truth in that dark place, which I think is what is hard for me as a Christian and interacting with people who are maybe non-believers. You know, the number one question is, how can you believe in a God when the world is so dark and painful and hurtful? That's always going to be the number one criticism, I think. And so that's kind of my response is like, I find God in the darkness. That's whenever I want to talk to him and communicate with him the most. You know, I'm not sitting down and praying when everything's going really well. I'm sitting down and praying whenever it's going really poorly.
Right.
And so that's why those songs really touch me so much. And as far as John's catalog, I really like Behind Your Eyes. That one's kind of a cheerful one, but it's also really acoustic driven.
Oh yeah.
Southbound Train, some of the really acoustic stuff like that are rank among my favorites for sure. Because I'm a guitarist, so that's really what touches me.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for sharing, man. And I will say the favorite song by Switchfoot is "If the House Burns Down Tonight." That is so powerful. It just reminds you of the brevity of life, and it's the most quote unquote rocking song by them. It's epic. I love driving listening to that, and they played it in Wilmington, and I was so excited, and it was so good, so good.
Yeah, you mentioned that. I remember you saying that's the one you wanted to hear, and you got it.
Yes.
So I think one thing that's cool for listeners is the thought that, you know, all of these classic writers, and it's true for me too, Dickinson in particular, C.S. Lewis, Milton as well. Milton is a big one for me, Tolkien. They really inform and shape how I think about things. But John Foreman is a cool example of a modern writer and a modern voice that really informs things. I think for me, Foreman's just sort of someone who's allows himself to sit in the doubt, and he's allowing himself to sit in the dark place, and he's pulling his truth and inspiration from that. Whereas a lot of people are kind of seeking the truth in the light and the bright and the happy places. So that's a way that he kind of speaks to me, and I can totally understand the pain that comes out of truth and the pain that comes out of just human existence. So how is it that Foreman maybe influences you like as a modern voice as in contrast to some of the classical voices?
Wow, that's a great question. And for me, he takes the influences from C.S. Lewis or Soren Kierkegaard and Tolkien and older musicians like Bono and U2 and Bob Dylan, Bob Marley, Simon and Garfunkel, and he's able to build off of those different writers and musicians, and he incorporates it in his really poignant, brilliant lyrics and melodies and harmonies. And when a modern musician like himself can build off of those foundational musicians and writers and thinkers and communicate in a modern day context, that's really hard to do. And he does such an incredible job with it. And I really admire that about him. And there's also not that sacred secular either or. As you were mentioning, he writes music for people of all worldviews, and you can see his faith in his music, but it's not any kind of cheesy platitudes or any nonsense like that. It's really honest, and that paradox of doubt and faith is in his songs. And Jesus, I Have My Doubts is a good example of that, and I really admire that about him. He's not afraid to express his doubts and his questions. And as someone who is very inquisitive and who, like yourself, struggles a lot with those existential reality of suffering and pain, and finding the agape love of Christ sustaining you in the dark and in the struggles, and I really relate to that, and I really admire that about him. And I've been able to just get so much creative inspiration from him, because some songs have inspired some of my stories. In fact, I wrote one essay with his name as the title, inspired by him in Tirnanog, and I just wanted to write an ode to him as a modern American poet, and I hope that he writes a book. In fact, it's about time he gets on with it, and he needs to write a book. I love the music's great, but I want a book from him, and hopefully he will he'll pump it out and get it out sometime soon, man, because he think about all the amazing experiences he can incorporate into a book about the healing power of music and the universality of music and the transcendence of music. So yes, let's hope he writes a book soon, sooner than later.
Sort of following up with that, and I think this is a really important question, and I think I try to figure out a theme or a thesis for every conversation that I have, and I think I've kind of identified what the theme of this conversation is, and I think we keep coming back to this idea of healing, and I think that this question really hits it right on the head. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say. So for you, is there an obligation to create something that impacts people?
Yes, I feel an innate yearning and longing to write honest and hopeful works that will convey hope and healing to people, and that it's possible. And also, my writings correlate with the way I live my life, and so they both come together. And I really am honored when people tell me that something I've written has encouraged them or made them laugh or moved them or helped them through a difficult time, or inspired them to read Neil Gaiman or Lewis or George MacDonald or Seamus Heaney or check out John Foreman. Yes, I definitely, and in fact, that innate need it has grown more, what's the right word I'm trying to think of? It's become even more intense, if that makes sense. And it keeps me out of my head, and it reminds me that it's all about community and human connection and healing. In fact, there's a wonderful quote, and I wish I could remember it. This is a paraphrase of it, but Madeleine L'Engle put it like this: that to write or compose or paint or draw is an effort towards wholeness.
Yeah, that's powerful. It's
Mm,
almost like that peace that you're seeking and that longing
mm,
that we have. It's almost like doing things that are purposeful and intentional are the way to catch that, the way to find that. It's like you, I think it's a common recurring theme in some of those older writers that their purpose is sort of derived and grows out of a need to create, and then their creation then follows up that purpose. And that's kind of what I'm sensing in your answer, is that now it's not even an obligation, it's just part of existing. It's
mm,
part of who you are. And so
mm,
I find that very inspiring.
mm,
Part of that too, and just to follow up, is do you, because it's becoming harder and harder for me not to express and communicate my faith in what I create. It's
mm,
just, it's so innate and it's such a part of my voice and who I am that it just sort of comes out, which I think
mm.
is true for Foreman and true for other writers and musicians. Um, are you able to separate your faith from your work, or is faith kind of what's pushing it forward? And how do you understand that?
Uh, that's a very good question. So, yes, all of my work is influenced by my faith. There's no separating my art from my faith. They correlate, and um, even if the poem is about James Joyce or Seamus Heaney, or expressing gratitude to the poet, that even though there might not be anything in that poem deliberately mentioning Jesus of Nazareth or Yahweh, or liturgy or sacramental view, it's still influenced by my faith, because I read every writer in the context of themes of um, redemption, and all the songs that I hear and all the films, even though the artists aren't deliberately conveying that, that's how I view it. And I find it it's get past those watchful dragons that Lewis talked about, and you can convey your faith in a way that people respect. And that's been my experience. People, friends that aren't religious or spiritual, or if they have a different worldview, they come to appreciate it, and they understand that it's not a form of proselytizing, but you it's you being honest about your own journey, that this is my journey and this is how I came to believe what I believe, and having people respect, because that could be really tricky to pull off. In fact, I was afraid of that. There was one friend who is a delightful person, and an atheist, and we have a very different worldview, but she read Surprised by Agape, and I read her wonderful book of stories and gave her it's very, very good, and gave her a 5-star review, because she definitely deserved it. But I was really nervous, because I thought, oh goodness, I hope she doesn't find this to be a form of proselytizing for Christianity, or trying to, form like a work of Christian apologetics, like trying to give evidence for how I came to believe it. But she, to my utter relief, she, after she read it, she said that, yes, this isn't you trying to convince other people to follow the Christian God. This is your own journey of healing and hope, and how you came to believe in Christ, and the role that myth and storytelling and the healing power of music and literature and art has played on that journey. And this is your own journey. And so that was such a relief. So that can be really tricky, because there's a lot of Christian art out there that's dishonest, that is not true to life, that's really harmful to people, especially that have been wounded by, the church, or maybe fundamentalism. And some things that out there are downright cheesy, like God's not dead. I mean, that's, yeah. I mean, things like that. And it's not, and I know some people probably find it helpful, and, a person's experience of art is subjective, but, yeah, I think things like that can be quite harmful. You want your art to be the best that it can be, and not to like have the cheesy Christianese, if you will, um, or to be some form of proselytizing, but you want it to be honest and hopeful at the same time. So that's been always my approach, and it's what I tell people too, and the way I live my life. Again, I live out my faith by grace and love people of all worldviews, and my daily life and my writings, they all correlate, and I think that's the way that it should be. My favorite artists and writers and thinkers, not all of them, because some were pretty terrible human beings, but for the most part, they their daily life correlated with what they were writing about.
You're always going to have your like Edgar Allan Poe's who, maybe wrote a couple of really cool pieces, but maybe the personal
Yeah.
life didn't line up so much the way that you wanted it to.
Yeah, or like F. Scott Fitzgerald. The prose of The Great Gatsby is great, but man, apparently he could be a very nasty individual and was not the most pleasant. And I've even read pieces from Ernest Hemingway, who knew him very well. That I know they were friends, but yeah, Hemingway said he could be a very difficult individual.
I guess the final something that I ask every single person, and I will continue asking every person, is what are you leaving behind if you died today? What is it that you had to say? What is it that was important? And did you say what that was? And I know what John Foreman's answer is, so
Yeah.
I'm definitely got my ears perked for your answer.
Well, I would what I would hope to say or to leave behind is that life is a precious sacramental gift, and and the people that are in it are an amazing sacramental gift, and it is a good thing to be alive and loved and appreciated, and to have that in your life is absolutely amazing. And I want to always be a writer, honest about the struggles and pain and doubts that are universal, but also a person of hope, because I couldn't ever write anything that's nihilistic or, there's already enough of that in the world. And in fact, I think it takes great courage to be a person of hope, a person of faith, hope, and love. And so I definitely want to leave that behind, and also encourage people to read the great myths and to, delve into Narnia and Middle Earth and Neil Gaiman and be part of that ancient bardic storytelling.
So to conclude, what I'd like to do is kind of the structure that I've been using for these is I want to ask you a series of 10 questions. And for those listening and watching, this is inspired by James Lipton, rest in peace. He had a show called Inside the Actor Studio in the 90s, and he concluded every interview with this series of 10 questions. So for me, because I'm a guy who kind of cares about context and things like that, I changed some of the questions out to make them a little bit more family friendly. Some of them were a little bit explicit. So they're not an exact copy of the questions that James Lipton would ask his guests. So the idea here is just rattle off the top of your head whatever comes to mind first. And then after we get done with that, I'm going to go through and kind of summarize the conversation and share a few thoughts. And then after I get done sharing some thoughts, I'm going to turn it over to you for the last word. So you can share whatever you're feeling, whatever thoughts you have about the conversation. And then don't forget to let people know those 3 recommendations, because I haven't forgotten it. That's important. And at the end, we'll shout you out. We'll tell people where to find your books, and we'll be good to go. So kind of kick it off like this. So first question, what is your favorite word?
Epic.
Okay. What is your least favorite word?
Rag.
What excites you?
Pubs.
Fair. What sound or noise do you love?
The sound of a latte being made, so steamed milk.
Okay. I'm slowly, just as a tangent there, I'm slowly building an affinity for coffee and sort of figuring out what I like. So I can get in there. What upsets you?
Psychological manipulation.
Oh, good one. What sound or noise do you hate?
Chalk on a board.
What motivates you to act every day when you wake up?
My faith.
Okay. Let's see. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Becoming a musician.
Okay. What profession would you not like to do?
Being a lawyer.
Got to construct some arguments. And finally, last question, and feel free to build on this one if you want into your final thoughts. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You lived a good, full, long life. You enjoyed good Guinness. You loved your wife, your family, your friends, and you pursued your vocation as a writer, and you had a very good sense of humor.
I love it. I would love to hear that too. Hopefully, I get something similar. I'm assuming you'll get that at the end. So just to conclude, I'm going to share a few thoughts, and I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of conclude and give your summarizing statements. We'll shout you out, and we'll be done. So my opinion, I think it was a really good conversation. I think the themes that we kept hitting were really that theme of healing and that theme of universal truth. Writing, music, all those different things really come together to inform our perspective of the world, but they also connect us. And so I think people will really gather from the conversation that we're two people who are really connected by some of those big moments and some of those inspiring writers and themes that they put in front of us. And if we both heard some of the same things and we both grew out of some of the same things, that means they must be pretty important. And I feel really good about that. I feel really positive about that shared experience. And that's really how we build these connections as humans. So that's my feeling, my sentiment. I really enjoyed having you on. Thank you for your time. Thank you for patience and bearing with me through some technical difficulties along the way, which hopefully readers or listeners and viewers, you're not picking up on that. The magic of editing hopefully has corrected it. So I'm going to let you speak and give your final thoughts, and then please share some recommendations for people listening, and then let everybody know where they can find your works.
Indeed. Well, it was quite an honor to be on your show. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I'm glad to promote your podcast. And people can find my works on Amazon. So if they Google Justin Wiggins, my writer's page will come up on Amazon. They'll find Tyrannod, Celtic Twilight, Marty and Irene, Surprised by Myth, and Surprised by Agape. They can also Google Inspired Justin Wiggins, and that'll pop up. My books will pop up on that website, and also Clarendon House Publications website. If you Google Justin Wiggins, Clarendon House Publications, and also have my Facebook writer's page and Instagram as well. And in regard to 3 particular works that I would recommend, one would be a book called 100 Poems by Seamus Heaney. It is an incredible book. Seamus Heaney is my favorite Irish writer. I have great respect for him. The second book would be Stardust by Neil Gaiman. It is a delightful, whimsical, moving, brilliantly written fairy tale. And Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite modern day writers. And the third book that I would recommend would be Surprised by Joy by C.S. Lewis. It's my favorite work by Lewis, and it's such an honest expression of how he found his literary vocation, his identity in Christ, and his love for myth and in literature, and it's really powerful. So those are 3 particular works that I would recommend for readers.
Beautiful. All right. Well, I thank you again for your time and for coming on. Like I said, it's been a great experience. I'm going to hit our outro music and then we're good to go.
Cheers.